Marc. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Marc, who is he's a pro. He's moderated what shows this year are we looking to have you at?
5, I think.
5, yes. So Marc is a pro, so I won't steal any of his thunder, but he's going to take us into our panel session, Securing the Future, CISO Insights, and Industry Leaders Discussing Current Cyber Threats and Strategic Defense Practices. Give it up.
Thank you so much. So first and foremost, thank you for being here. I think it's very important that we all get together as practitioners, if you will, and more importantly, we understand and figure out how to do things better. So on the backs of that, everybody's already experienced the CrowdStrike issue. We're not going to blame CrowdStrike, but we're going to certainly dive into incident response right away. So I want to ask the panel specifically, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? How should incident response help us in situations like that? Who would like to go first?
I can.
All right.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, well first, I need 2 drinks for this week. I don't know about you guys. Probably a lot of us were impacted. One of the great things about any type of just security blip or impact to our environment allows us so many lessons learned. Even if it didn't happen to you and say you had another EDR agent, the amount of lessons learned that you can take and allow to do tabletop exercises, improve your policies from a people, processes, and technology standpoint, you should be embracing this. Of course, every challenge is exhausting. I'm still exhausted from COVID and other, SolarWinds, Log4j, losing other Christmases because of incident response. But we have to not just kind of point fingers, but we do have to improve. We have to do self-reflection on our organization and think full life cycle and not just stop because we don't like documentation. I'm sorry, we have to think full life cycle on people. Do we have enough staff? 2, is our processes, checklist, run books, are they efficient? Not just from a policy, but our technical controls as well. Are we tuned properly? Do we need a SOAR platform to help us? And then in addition to that, who are our partners, our cultures, seeing if there's gaps, and then of course our technologies. Right now we're in such a tech consolidation play, but do we have too many single point of failures? I don't know. So we have to be very reflective during these moments. So sometimes, yes, they're a challenge, and yes, they're exhaustive, but look at them in a positive way and get the damn budget you finally need. Cheers to that.
Excellent. So let me rebound right off of that with, you mentioned tabletop exercises, and I love that you did that, because in my opinion, I've seen too often, they're engineered for success, just like a DR test, right? It's, I'm going to only test this much. I'm only going to rehearse this much.
Shame on that.
Why should we go beyond that? Merlin?
Yeah, so, okay. So that's a real challenge because, in my role, I do a lot of tabletop exercises with clients, and a lot of clients aren't to that point yet to where you can really dive deep into it. So, I do like 2 different types of tabletop exercises. So if a client has never done that before, I do like more of an educational thing because incident response is a brand new thing to them. They might have an incident response plan. We always review it before we do a tabletop exercise so we can align to that. But the first one's usually an educational one, and then once they kind of get that level of maturity and understanding, then I'll do a deep dive one. And one of the scenarios I'll say is that the CISO is on a cruise and isn't accessible via cell phone or anything. What are you going to do? Who's your go-to person? Who can make the call to make a ransomware payment? Now, what happened with CrowdStrike? How can you plan for every event? You can't. Who would foresee something like that would happen? But if you have a good, robust plan and you've exercised that, you can kind of pivot from that because you know how to handle incidents and can respond accordingly.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Parker.
Ironically, not 3 weeks ago, was I running a day-long business continuity tabletop exercise with one of my clients. And I called out hey, we're talking about your critical vendors. This, all your money's coming from this one vendor being active. do you have an alternate that you can switch to? Do you have contracts in place where you can go that avenue? And in that tabletop, they decided, hey, if this vendor goes down, we're just gonna limp along, go pen and paper, and wait for them to come back because they're really the only player we can play with here. And ironically, my customer was not directly impacted, but that vendor was, and that vendor was offline for this CrowdStrike thing. And my customer was like, yeah, we talked about this. We had a plan for this, so we know what we're communicating to all of our staff. We know actually how we're responding to this. So I think this does really just show that, yeah, you have to have those conversations. You have to take more time because certainly some customers and clients, it's like, hey, this is a compliance objective. I want to spend 30 minutes with you and get this done. But the pushing on the businesses of like, hey, this is a serious thing. I need multiple players in the room. I need the CEO to step in for different sessions here so that we can talk about this and we can get agreement here of, hey, what are we doing after this? Who are we following up with, right? And where are we getting these plans in place? So I think that's actually the bigger thing, that before we talk incident response with what happened, we should have been addressing something from business continuity. And in some places, this is one of those things where, yeah, businesses might go, we just got to sit with it, right? If Microsoft goes offline, they're not going to go spin up, Google Workspaces. They're going to go, hey, we've got a certain tolerance here of downtime. So that's where you should have those conversations and you should agree, because there are some organizations where it's like, yeah, actually, no, if Microsoft goes down, we need to immediately spin up a new domain and get over to Google Workspaces because we're losing money while that's gone. That may come from those conversations, but I think that's probably the more important lesson from some of this is you got to have those business continuity conversations.
Excellent. Gina?
Yeah, so the only kind of quick comment I want to make is, one, I think we need to do more tabletop exercises. I think we need to force the topic. I'm tired of cybersecurity professionals' feelings getting hurt because they don't want to know that their backups aren't immutable, or they're not doing backups on, every 4 hours or whatever, or they don't even know their recovery time objectives. Some of that's okay, but I think a lot of times we're too much covering for each other because we were taught to protect it because maybe the CTO doesn't want to look bad in front of the board. Well, guess what? We now have to ruin our Christmases and our weekends and whatever, and there are now, the SEC wants roles and responsibilities defined. We have to cut the shit, guys, all right? And we have to do these tabletop exercises. We have to define roles and responsibilities, and we have to challenge the organization to be better, and we have to be better as well, in my opinion.
No, excellent. So let me ask the obvious next question, which is, who owns what? Who owns business continuity? Who owns disaster recovery? Who owns incident response? Now, I'll say I have my personal opinion. My personal opinion is the business owns business continuity. And all too often, they push it off to us to do it for them. They ask us to do the impact analysis. They ask us to define what's right, what's wrong, what's not. And I'll be the first to tell you, I've consulted in healthcare, which is what I do now, but I've consulted in healthcare for many other organizations. If I can go to United Airlines and say, give me your 55 mission critical functions and give me your mission critical systems, and they say, oh, I've got 55. Well, that's ironic. Why do only 9 of them overlap? It's because the business never owned the function. The business runs the function, but they never owned the impact analysis thereof. Your thoughts?
Yeah, this is frequently a conversation I have with multiple CISOs, and was actually just talking to somebody about there's almost 2 types of CISOs in common environments. The ones that are like, hey, I'm here, I have this job, and the board, if I mention, hey, I need money for anything, the board's gonna be like, you're not our guy, right? And so they play the role, and they're good at playing the role. They're not bad at being CISOs, but the organization has set them of like, no, this is where you stay. Don't get outside of that. And then I also have conversations with CISOs that get into environments and they're like, hey, they don't know anything from risk management and ownership of specific risk, and I'm not about to be that fall guy. I'm not about to be the one that takes that. And so they go in and they go, the first thing I'm doing is risk management program and identifying owners of those risks, and it's not gonna be me.
Excellent. Merlin?
Yeah, so I've actually been a CISO several times, and I'm CISO of my company as well as leading our advisory practice. And it's tough, especially if you go into an environment that doesn't really understand risk. They don't understand cybersecurity. So it's easy to sit back and say, you got to do these things, but it's like when you're in that seat and you're getting, and if you report to the CIO or CTO, your hands are kind of tied sometimes. And it's like you can't really go to the CEO and like say, hey, my boss, the CTO, won't let me do this. But what I've done in those situations is I educate like the CEO and the board of like, you're the ones who really own the risk. I'm just here to facilitate, advise you, because security is a lot like the in-house law department. They just really advise the organization on what to do. They don't say, hey, you can't sign that contract. They'll say, we advise you not to sign the contract, but in the end, they're just advising, and that's what security is really about too. And it is a real problem where a lot of the burden is put on security of like, hey, you have to make this work, but we're not going to give you any budget and support. And if you're in that kind of situation, then really you should leave and find somewhere else, an organization that will support you.
No, I absolutely agree with it. I think there's one thing we all have to recognize. Recently, CISOs have come under fire as the fall guy, as the responsibility for the actions. In reality, the fiduciary responsibility is at the board and the CEO level. Let that sink in. Yes, we are responsible for setting the vision. We are responsible for standing up the program. But the moment we allow that risk not to be heard by the board or by the CEO, we failed ourselves and we failed our people. So let's go back to after-action reports. I love that you brought that up, that, hey, we have to go back and we have to learn. And frankly, guys, that's what we're trying to say. Tabletop exercises are meant for you to learn. Yes, do you want to show regulators that you're doing something annually and that you've been successful? Absolutely. And for that, okay, maybe you need to limit your scope. But you know what? It doesn't do any of us any good to limit that scope because we never learn. We don't know where our holes or our gaps are. So after action reports, any thoughts there?
Well, they're needed, of course. And after action reports, you have to put those risks into your risk register. So it's not that you're just creating a report to create a report. That needs to go to the risk register, as well as when you're thinking about these muscle movements in terms of learning and educating and going back. Tabletop exercises aren't just to be, punitive or you didn't do this or that. It's also to celebrate what you're doing and also sympathize with what you have done with either the short staff or knowing that you don't have the tools or the technology, or to understand that you may need to give a budget to get more training or vendor credits to find more training for that platform. In addition to that, as a CISO for any organization, it is your goal to, one, educate the board, the CIO, CTO, CFO, whoever you fall under, or legal, on what you're seeing. You have to learn how to talk like a risk manager, or talk like, if you're with the CFO, really understand business impact and what that actually means to the organization. You have to also align your North Star to the organization, and when you're talking their language, You start social engineering them. It takes a while. I've talked to many boards, and Rome was not built in a day, nor will your cyber program. But when you're starting to teach them and include them, it's very important. And there's some amazing things like the New York Department of Financial Services, which is NYDFS. Part of their statute requires, executives, somewhat could be board, involvement in a tabletop exercise regarding ransomware. How smart, it's prescriptive, because that's a statute. So when we think about, if that's a statute, and we think about what best practices are, and we have a framework that's broad, and we can point, well, states are now requiring executive leadership to be a part of. Best practices is to have an operational and executive tabletop exercise. And then you're giving them the report. You're telling them what the after actions are, and you're communicating like we're humans. I know, it's crazy. After the pandemic, it's weird.
What, it's not AI?
It's not AI. Well, I don't know. I feel like that last session might have been, and the keynote was definitely. But, there's some aspects to that, is being human. We're human. That aspect is so needed. And I think communication and written communication also is very important in our community.
Excellent. Merlin?
Yeah, so I think taking that a step further is that it's one thing to explain to them risk, but you have to align it to the business because the CEO and the board are making business decisions that impact revenue, business growth, all sorts of things. And so as security leaders, you have to be able to understand, how's your business make money? What are the strategic initiatives of the business to grow and increase revenue? And so there's times where it's like, yeah, there's projects I want to do, but it's like, well, the business wants to spend money on this particular area. So as a CISO, I have to figure out ways to adjust to that to be able to still reduce risk, maybe not be able to reduce it as much as I want to, but still be able to, reduce some risk while the business is continuing to meet the business objectives.
Yeah, and I think you touched on an important part that just security practitioners kind of can get confused, is that security is business enablement, right? And so it is alignment with the business itself and not the framework and not the book that says, you have to do XYZ, right? All of that is generalized anyway, but if you get so stuck on, well, the book says we have to have this, and you don't apply business context to like what you're implementing and what you're pushing for, then you're fighting the wrong battle, because at the end of the day, security should be looking to make the business more profitable, right? So identifying those biggest areas of like, hey, having no backups is actually going to be the most impactful thing to the organization. So let's bubble that up. Let's have that conversation. Let's make sure the business continues in different ways, and then continuing to work towards maturity over time in different ways. But I think that business enablement should be the focus of security, and I think a lot of people get that wrong about the CISO position. It's not a cybersecurity position. It is a business management position. Like you're dealing with the board, you're dealing with other C-level executives in different ways, and they are looking to you as an advisor for their business, not an advisor for what does NIST say, right? So I think that was an important piece that you touched on. I wanted to double down. A lot.
Excellent. We'll come back to that business discussion here in a minute, but let's pivot over to one of the things you just said, Parker, about frameworks. How many in the audience, by a show of hands, are in a regulated industry? Maybe a third of us. So that means 2/3 of us do not have any compliance-specific regulations that we need to abide by. We're not beholden to any government entity to say do this, do that. But there is still a responsibility for us to do something as practitioners to protect that business. So let me ask the panel, from a perspective of framework of regulation. One, I don't want you to name a framework, but should we be going to the level of, say, I'm in healthcare, HIPAA, or should we be going different? If I'm in energy, should I be going to NERC? What should I be doing from a framework perspective to help my organization be better?
So I'll give you the best answer. It depends, right?
Wait a minute, you're a consultant.
Yeah. So all of this, again, comes down to business context, but at the end of the day, money is what's driving a lot of this, right? That's what the business exists for, to make money. And in a lot of ways, even if you aren't technically under compliance for a specific thing like HIPAA, you might actually be working with customers who are like, hey, we want to use you, but we don't have confidence that you meet these requirements, right? And so that actually drives more than just compliance. Is what are your customers saying about your security practices? And so some industries, some companies are like, I don't play in any of that regulated space. I don't hold anything that's particularly important. We're a 3-person company. I don't care, right? Like, I'm not going to say, hey, you need to be NIST compliance, right? Or whatever, ISO, whatever framework you want to grab. What's relevant to your business, right? You're making $100,000 in revenue a year. Like, yeah, you need to just do the bare minimum of what's available to you. Have your MFA,
Don't spend
right?
200,000?
Yeah, exactly. So that's why the answer is it depends, right? Where's the money coming from, and where can the money go out from, right? Because if you get a HIPAA violation, guess what? The Attorney General's probably coming with hefty fines. So there's those specific business considerations, and unfortunately, that's the way I look at it. Is, yeah, the book says this, the business looks like this.
Yep.
I say everybody's regulated because there's the thing called the law, and the law protects data on PII. So you have employee data, you have customers' data, and if it gets disclosed by a bad actor, you have to report on that. Of course, there's each state with this patchwork of privacy laws. So I think in a way we're all regulated. I don't know what that framework looks like to you. I think it's based on the size and complexity of your organization. I love what you said there. It's a business driver, makes you business, well, this organization is SOC 2 Type 2 for their application, and we're not. So customers may go to this organization as opposed to us. So there's aspects to having kind of or surround yourself with a framework. But I think for the most part, small or medium business, you want to abide by, if that's the Center for Internet Security Critical 18 or NIST CSF, or insert a custom framework here, Cloud Security Alliance if you're in the cloud, or whatever you want. But you have to abide by a reasonable, care when it comes to data. We all have to be champions, and our head in the sand, definitely doesn't work. And so, if you're publicly traded, we have the SEC to, abide against. And I was healthcare to high trust certifications, kangaroo court that is. But that allowed me to, really understand frameworks very well.
That's a different story.
Where's the third glass of wine? But, there's an aspect. Compliance, though, does not equal security,
right.
Period. Really, it's period. And so when we're thinking about compliance, it's usually on a scope system. And really, we have to think about even HQ, because that is our employee data. That is our intellectual property. That's our legal data. So there's a lot of things that a lot of times we focus on what is just our scope systems for PCI or healthcare or whatever. But we also have to look internally at even HQ, because that actually has coveted information, and even our emails have tons of coveted information as well. So,
Merlin?
Yeah, I was kind of chuckling when you were talking because I've been doing cybersecurity for over 25 years, and it used to be called IT security when I first started, and then people realized like, hey, we got protect employee data and such. So,
Even the bowling scores?
or golf scores or whatever. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I mean, choosing a framework is just a good thing. So it helps inform your roadmap, and it's something that you can point back to with your executives and the board when you're asking for funding.
Excellent. Okay. So I'll ask a twofold question pivoting off of that. We've talked about how we need to speak the business language. So then the second part of that is, when should we be engaged then to vet a partner, a vendor, a service? Anybody?
Well, it's funny because that's a loaded question. So, like as we talked about with SDLC and the process with that of shifting left, I often refer to it as shifting left with that as well. It's like, and so that's where I think a lot of people don't think about this. Of like when you align to the business, that's also aligning to people. And so as a CISO, I talk with the leaders of the different departments frequently because I want to know what they're doing. I'll even have members of my security team talk to individual contributors on those teams because I want to know everything that's going on with the organization. And I always pick on marketing for like third-party stuff because they always use a lot of different tools. And so have a good relationship with them. Understand what business problem are they trying to solve. And again, we've talked about security being an enabler. When I first started off in security, it was known as the department to just say no to everything. It's like, no, you can't do that. If you're just going to say no to everything, they're just going to bypass you and do what they want anyhow to solve their business needs. So, that's aligning to the business of like helping the business move forward, help people do their daily jobs, understand that, and work hand in hand with them to find a secure solution that solves their issue, as well as that reduces risk and doesn't present more risk to the organization.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think that, hey, not being the business of no, especially on vendor onboarding and management, you have to create a way to get to yes, right? You have to have a path that says, all right, in some cases, director of marketing can just approve a vendor and say, yes, I want to move forward, understanding the risk, understanding, what has been assessed. And there are some cases where it's like, hey, we really got to talk to the CEO about this one because it's touching way too much. It's creating some risk that we can't find a way to mitigate. We can't find a way to, reduce in different ways. So I think when it comes to vendor management, obviously there's different life cycles in it, but you have to have a path to yes. And as cybersecurity practitioners, we're really risk adverse. And so it's really hard to be like, I see risk, I want to say no. I don't want that in my environment. That gives me heartburn. But ultimately, we've got to have the business taking on the ownership of that risk, right? We just need to find a way that it's a clear path to yes.
Not to go over what these gentlemen just said, so I'm going to go kind of pivot. I think right now is such an excellent time to lean in as we're building our AI Center of Excellence and or vetting AI chatbots or co-pilots or insert whatever has AI in the marketing language here, is actually enabling a committee that is looking and helping the security team vet technologies. And when you enable a committee that is so excited about this transformative age, for them to understand and be with you as part of that vendor due diligence, the understanding you're teaching them about risk tolerance, the different controls, having them understand the life cycle of vendor due diligence, you're equipping them something for their resume, they're learning, but also you're making them a future champion. So vendor due diligence, of course, it's from the beginning is the answer, okay? It's from the beginning. We should be involved in the beginning to a certain extent, of course. But this is a great time for us to lean in and open, not to the world, but open some people in to learn so that they can then be security champions in the future.
I absolutely agree. I think one thing that a lot of us forget is we enable the business, period, regardless of whether it's security. As IT, as technology, they cannot survive without us today. okay? That doesn't mean we need to wield that power and extort them for it, right? But what it does mean is instead of going off and developing their own strategies and execution plans and then throwing the proverbial hand grenade over the fence to you to say, go, now you're 6 months in and you're struggling to meet their goals, we can't get to a place of meeting those goals if we weren't there to set the strategy to meet them in the first place. So back to your point of being involved in the beginning, we are no longer the Department of No if we give input to the business decision to say, this vendor, and this vendor have this risk, this risk, this risk. Make your decision and then understand you may need to mitigate those and accept some of that risk. But that's yours to handle, business, not us in security.
And one of the important pieces of getting there at the beginning is a lot of my recommendations on risk mitigation are contractual, right? Let's get specific about the language we're putting in here. Let's put a requirement for ISO certification. Let's put a requirement for extra cybersecurity insurance. So yes, pen testing, all of those requirements that are standard in a lot of contracts, but that's why if you get the cybersecurity nerds involved early in the process, we can actually affect the contract language to provide some risk transfer back to the vendor.
I would like to be called a geek.
We can also offer options. Okay, Mr. Vendor, you don't have MFA, I can put you behind my MFA, and then protect the organization. Excellent. So let's pivot that to cloud security. Where are businesses making the biggest assumption when it comes to cloud security? Loaded question, who wants it?
As the old guy on the panel, I'll start off because, it just is mind-blowing to me that we're making the same mistakes in the cloud as what we made with on-prem IT. And actually worse in some ways. And the reason why I say worse is that, when we had IT sprawl and, shadow IT on-prem, it's like you had to go buy a physical box to be able to do that. In the cloud, it's like I can, set up a EC2 instance in AWS in just a few seconds. And so I think that where we're really failing is governance in the cloud. That there is so much stuff that's running in the cloud that the organization doesn't even know about. I know organizations where, like, the developers are the ones that are actually running the production cloud environment. That there's not like a separate, cloud team that's managing that. It's like, and I know the cloud people don't like to hear this, but it's like it's IT in the cloud. It's like it's not much different. I mean, you do things a little bit different, but it's IT in the cloud, and they don't want you to call it that, But yeah, I just see just a lack of governance in there. And so, things are not following any sorts of processes. There's no security. It really is the Wild West. And I'm really shocked and disappointed as an industry that that's the way things have gone in the cloud, because we should have learned that, 20 years ago with on-prem IT.
I couldn't agree more with you. One, we overcomplicate the cloud. We think it's somebody else's computer, so we don't have to secure it. We don't staff it properly. We don't, for a data center, we're gonna staff the hell out of that. For the cloud, it's like 2 guys in a truck, and we're expecting them to have full identity, make sure there's no misconfigurations, there's data backup. Oh yeah, where is your data? They don't even know their assets. They're not tied to SSO. The amount of I can do a security assessment on the cloud probably within 5 questions and understand the risks that are there. It is terrible right now for a lot of even enterprises, which should have the funding to staff, but they still think that the cloud, the transference of risk goes to a lot of the SaaS applications or AWS, Google, or GCP. And because they're thinking of a SaaS mentality in some respects. But even when we think about the SaaS aspects, a lot of SaaS applications aren't tied back to SSO. So we have this complete complete lack of governance. I loved that. But we really don't know the identities and the shadow IT and what's really running on the network from an observability perspective, visibility perspective, and the amount of blind spots that are out there, and the developers.
You mean the cloud providers don't give you visibility? What? You can't understand your IOPS, but yet they want you to pay for a next level? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think there's another side of this too, of like being cybersecurity practitioners, of where we might be getting it wrong. One side of that is pushing more expectation on these vendors to be like, hey, let's go MFA by default, and if we want to remove that, we can remove that. If that becomes an inhibitor to us doing business, we can set some of those controls. Now, obviously, these AWS, GCP, they want usability, right? Hey, lowest friction to get you on board, but I think GitHub has set a good example of like, hey, turns out we can do this simple step of requiring MFA from the start, and that doesn't limit people's ability to utilize our expectations. So I think on that side, there should be more pressure from our side as cybersecurity practitioners to be like, hey, turn these things on by default, please, as an industry, so that we can make the choice as a business to turn them off. And then I think the other side too is that companies are going to these cloud resources to enable the business again, right? They're trying to move in different directions, scale in different ways, and the more that cybersecurity becomes that path to yes, the more cybersecurity gets introduced at the beginning, so that even though AWS doesn't enforce MFA up front, cybersecurity gets to go, hey, while you're designing this, also, here's all the controls that we need to make sure are in place up front, and that your design needs to consider that these controls are going to be there, because as soon as IT just starts building and you go, wait, we got to introduce like network security groups. They go, what? That's going to break everything. That's going to take me an extra, 2 weeks of just configuring. And it's like, whoa, if we would have got there at the engineering stage, we would have been able to limit that impact to IT. So that's cybersecurity taking ownership of how businesses are going into the cloud of like, yeah, let's find the path to yes.
Yeah, I think that it's a great pivot into, it's great that certain industries have regulation, but we all know when legislators get involved, they don't have understanding of what it is they're actually legislating in this space. It's good that they're holding companies accountable in finance and healthcare and so forth, but we as an organizational element need to put the pressure back on the vendors to say, look, you have a responsibility to us. If we're going to buy your hardware, if we're going to buy your software, it needs to abide by these guidelines. And I'll bring up IoT as a perfect example of that. Who wins in IoT? The first one to the market, and they don't care what security is involved. I mean, who knows how to control IoT, whether it's medical device or on operational technology, a RPA, et cetera, especially when it's running on Windows NT and whatever nefarious operating system that's 20 years old we can find. So let me ask the team, the panel, how do we take care of IoT? How do we make sure it's secure?
Yeah, it's a big challenge, and I actually have OT experience, and the challenge is availability, because I mean there's like lots of environments that they have to be up 24 hours, and so it's like, how do you patch systems in there when you only have maybe, I mean seriously, you might only have 10 minutes a month.
You mean you can patch IoT?
Sometimes.
Even
Yeah.
if the OS is like unsupported for 10 years?
I mean, I mean, you just have to do your best. I mean, you have
Who let him come up here? Ask these questions.
I know. He's just talking theoretical. No, I mean, you have to sometimes you just can't because because the operational requirements for it. So in those situations, I do my best to be able to segment that off. If the IoT environment has to be accessed by a third-party vendor that's monitoring or managing that, maybe making some changes to your PLCs or something like that, put in a jump server and have all sorts of security controls on that. So, I'm just looking at ways to be able to segment that off as much as I can, and then have monitoring so that way you're alerted if something's happening. But yeah, it's a real challenge. I actually had this conversation with a few leading OT security experts at the RSA conference this year, and they said that they really target the top about 4% of vulnerabilities to be able to patch, because that's all they have time for. With being able to take down the environment and be able to address them.
Absolutely. We have a question?
In my humble opinion, industrial control systems, we're talking about OT, need to be separate from the internet. And that's ideally the way it works. And so you might have a one-way gateway going out. You might have an air gap, which you then also need to control an air gap, right? If it's on a thumb drive, for sure. But ideally, it has no connection to the internet. So what it does then, they might have it populate a server on the outside that emulates the industrial control system, or the devices emulate it. And so then, and those can be connected to the internet and to the users within the company. And if that goes down, then they can repopulate it. Now there's some other intricacies in terms of keeping the industrial control system up to date. And so ideally that would be supervised quite closely by the engineers that run it.
Yeah. So I agree with you in many different dimensions to that. One, it's very, very complex. I had 3 hospitals during COVID. Right now we consult with a lot of oil and gas and TOLA oil and gas here in Colorado, and hospitals and things like that. So the question regarding the complexity of this topic can be very overwhelming. I would say there's some strides being made, but really I think something we were alluding to here is it really does come to some really thoughtful architecture and planning and design. So when we think also right now, you can do a NIST, risk assessment. Mm-hmm. You can also do testing. You can also think about, from a asset discovery and inventory through agentless ways to even know what maybe IoT devices that you have. But during COVID, it was really a big worry for us that we would have a ransomware attack through IoT devices. And I remember when the government had in heightened warnings for us at hospitals, that could happen. And so thinking about how people are connecting and how they should or should they be connected to the environment, or, is it a one-way tunnel, or is GE have it or do they not? Do we contact the vendor to see, hey, listen, we know of these threats. Does the vendor got it? Do we not? Do we have to put it on better visibility with our SOC if we could even get alerting? So there is a lot of complexity in this topic, which is really difficult. But if you will be at DEF CON, there is a healthcare village, and there's some other types of things regarding that. And it is a great place to be right now in this space, because the connected device it's real, and the more and more that we think about the future of us, I have 3 devices on me right now, but when we think about out there in the world, we're all connected in some capacity, and we have to think about, and I loved your security and privacy by design, but we have to be thoughtful, shifting left when we're designing and when we're thinking about what we're bringing into our architecture, because a lot of that, especially at hospitals, it's going to live there for 18,565 million years before elephants and dinosaurs ruled the earth.
Yeah, and that's an important piece here, is that a lot especially in the OT side of things, this infrastructure existed before security really even started looking that direction. And that's where it's like now we're already behind the 8 ball because none of these practices are in place. And so when you're getting into those environments and it's like, where do I start? I'm gonna go back to your tabletop, right? Start having conversations about, okay, what happens when your OT goes down for whatever reason? And then the business starts going, oh yeah, that's $1 million lost every hour, right? And then the business starts solving some of these problems up front. The business starts going, oh, we should segment this stuff from the internet, right? So if you're having trouble of like, what do I do? How do I deal with OT? How do I get, the business to take this seriously? Sit down, do a nice BCP tabletop and go, hey, OT's offline. The thing that's making you money, producing whatever it is it needs to produce, how much money are you losing every hour this is down? Okay, how long does it take to recover this system? And I've had customers that they're like, it would take us 2 weeks to rebuild that. It's like, okay, so do you maybe want to have a replica of that around? Would that be beneficial? And the business immediately went to go build a replica. I didn't have to lead any project or anything like that. So those are helpful conversations when starting this, how do we deal with IoT, OT?
Absolutely. So when we think about the bigger picture and we understand that there's only 3 things you can do with risk, right? You can accept it, you can mitigate it, or you can do what? Transfer it. And so we talk about cybersecurity insurance. We talk about ignore it.
Yeah,
Put our head in the ground.
the default setting.
We have to understand that we do not all want to be the same level of maturity. Even if we're in the same industry, we have to make a business decision about what we're willing to accept based upon our business model. So everybody probably knows CMMI, right? Not everybody wants to be a 5 because the cost to get there is astronomical. But we can live with a 3, a 3.5, whatever the case may be. So let me ask, when we start looking at emerging threats and we keep that context in mind, what are the next threats that we need to tackle in priority?
I think we don't need to get ahead of ourselves by going, oh, there's all these new threats to our environment just because there's new methods of attack. Social engineering's always been a threat, just because now we've got deep fakes and generative AI to help support that threat. We just shift in the way that we're educating others. We shift in the way that we add additional layers of control, right? So we are aware that this inherent need for humans to have trust, you can't do business without some level of trust. Knowing that exists, right? That's not a new threat, right? There's just some new technology that's going to try and exploit it. So I think emerging threats, there's obviously going to be different tactics to go about it. Change your training a little bit on social engineering, and hey, even if you think you're talking to somebody, you're probably not talking to somebody. But if you haven't been pushing the training of don't trust anything, even if it's something that sounds good, sounds like it's true. I always joke with everyone I work with of, hey, yeah, I don't read any of your emails because I think it's all a phishing attempt. You're trying to get me to do something I don't want to do. So
What, not TLDR?
yeah. So yeah, I mean that's one layer. Like obviously AI deepfakes is what everybody's like. That's the new threat vector, but it's kind of the same threat just with a new face.
Excellent.
Parker, is that you? Are you real?
Prove that you're not a robot.
Can I have your driver's license and social security number? And birth? Where's your where are you where are you born? Just kidding. Guys, cybersecurity best practices, best practices, best practices. IT best practices. Like I think a lot of things I agree. It's just with a new name, a new face, right? Social engineering is a great thing. It comes back to data, period. And I know a lot of you guys, we have, and growls, right? Me too. I mean, we've had in our Security Plus book, in our CISSP or CISM, or insert whatever book here, a chapter on data. Tells us about the entire data lifecycle, and we're still getting it wrong. There was also a chapter on assets that we're also getting wrong, and software development, and we're getting that wrong too. But when we think about it, goes back to brilliance in the basics and mastering the fundamentals and thinking about your security controls. But right now, our biggest threat in our organization is a data loss. A lot of times our enforcement and our laws and how we have to report goes back to data. And most of the time, we don't have an inventory. We don't have a classification. Our retention policy, who even knows that that's real? Our classification policy, who even knows it's real? And so the thing is if we're thinking about the future of AI, if we're thinking in the future of SOAR and automation, if we're thinking in the future of prioritization on a business impact analysis for our critical systems, we have to understand our data. We have to understand how much it costs, because it is, one, the new oil, the new soil, the new whatever. Those terms have been thrown out for a long time. We still getting it wrong, and I'm not saying that you have to go out and be like, I'm gonna understand my data in my entire organization tomorrow. Start small. Just start with your O365 or your Gmail environment, okay? Start small, but you have to start somewhere. Because let me tell you, if you lean into it now, you are gonna be the most powerful cybersecurity practitioner out there. You're gonna run circles around everybody else, and most likely, you're gonna be the CIO, CTO, or whatever you wanna be tomorrow. Because all of these, we're gonna have a convergence of CIOs and CISOs, I think, because IT ops and security ops, we have to come together, and I think we saw that during CrowdStrike a little bit this week.
Excellent. Merlin?
So I guess going back to what you said earlier, it depends. So data is important to some organizations. Your OT environments that are like generating our electricity, not so much. It's the availability. So it really depends on the industry and what the, going back to aligning to the business. What is the business in business to do? Like the power company's in business to generate electricity. So their information is important. It's keeping the lights on, literally, is the most important for them. I definitely agree that understanding the security fundamentals and addressing those. I stopped years ago. I stopped referring to like patch management, vulnerability management, those kind of things as basics, because I think it sends the wrong message that it's easy to do. And it's actually really hard to do. Asset management is really hard to do. When you look at CIS 18, first principle is knowing your hardware assets. That's actually really hard to do. We're a company of a little over 100 people and growing. It's like, it's a challenge for that. And I've worked in very large companies of 150,000 or more people, and it's a real challenge in there. So it just really depends. And I think that as practitioners, we have to not get caught up with the next new thing, and really make sure that we're addressing the fundamentals. How many organizations can actually patch all the critical vulnerabilities within 30 days? Most can't. And I mean, they'll say they can, but they're not. I mean, when you look at some of these big breaches that have happened, the attackers found that one server that didn't have updated patches. And so it's like that's a failure for their vulnerability management program, it's a failure for their asset management program. So that's one of the things I would just really encourage us all to do, is just not lose sight of those fundamentals and make sure that you just get better and better at those.
And I think also with trying to keep up with, latest and greatest threats and trends, it's too much to keep up with as an individual. Even at one point, I was resistant to learning, what's the difference between ML and LLM? Because I was like, I don't want to get into that. That's such a lot. And then I got into it, and I was like, oh, there's a lot here. I understand this better. I can convey this risk better. And I'm no AI expert, but because that is something that has emerged in different ways, I had to kind of understand it. And I didn't just go it alone. I partnered with a lot of other organizations, with other people. This community is a great community. So if you're having concerns about what's emerging, what's the next threat and things, make sure you're having conversations with others, because there's no world where you're going to keep up on the emerging threats. Technology moves way too fast. I learn stuff from my children about technology. So take that information from others, and don't feel like you have to be the expert on, hey, what's emerging here.
Excellent. So I don't want to be in front of you guys getting prizes and the like. So we have about 5 minutes left. Let's open it up to questions and see what we've left burning in your brains. Don't everybody speak at once. Down front? So either we've done a really good job or a really bad job. I don't know.
Are they still awake?
Lots of yawns. You mentioned several times about where CISO or security should live at the C level. Might all have 3 different opinions, but what C-level branch do you think it should live under? Like the CFO, CIO, CTO? Where do you guys think it's best to live?
Yeah, personally, I think it needs to live at the CEO because it's a business risk. It's no longer IT security. It's cybersecurity or whatever, information security, whatever you want to refer to it. And because really, at the end of the day, the CEO is the one who owns the risk for the entire company and the board, of course. But on the day-to-day, it's the CEO. And I've seen, I have peers of mine who report to the CEO. I currently report to the CEO as CISO of our company, and it's much more effective, believe me. Because, when you're reporting to like a CIO or CTO, there's so many conflicting priorities there because they're trying to move the business forward with new technologies, and that's often absent of security.
What, they don't want you dragging them down?
So in my past, I've reported to a CIO, legal, and both times I would say every one of my board reports would have been changed, modified to their best interest, right, and reported up. Publicly traded companies, board reporting is definitely different from privately held companies. But when you think about the best interest of making IT look good or whatever, that's a competing interest between security and IT. Now, granted, I do think IT and security need to be partners. That's something that the CISO and CIO or CTO or whatever it is in the organization, all of those people need to work together, period. That has to be a very good synergy. That needs to not be kind of a conflict. However, when you're reporting up to a board and you have these blockers so that they're made to look good, or they're saying they're the no department to a budget, but there is true risk to the organization, or there is some type of liability where the actual key stakeholders could be found civilly and or criminally liable, and your board report, either from legal and or CTO or CIO, is being inhibited, that can't happen. That has to change. And so when we think about that, that has to be at the same level. I don't see it kind of working. Now, granted, there is organizations I do see it working at because there's a good relationship where the CISO falls under a CIO and it does work, and they're not hampered when they report to the board. But in my past and in my experience, every time, but till currently, I have been, kind of muted reporting to the board. So,
Yeah, definitely think that there should be CISOs on boards, right? There should be somebody with CISO experience on every board out there. That should really be a requirement. But in terms of reporting structure, the good old answer of it depends, right? There's different ways to look at this that we kind of glorify the CISO position as a cybersecurity industry, and it doesn't have to be the only risk, compliance, cybersecurity position at an organization, right? That work can be split up in different ways if appropriate to the business. And I don't think we need to necessarily land on, well, the CISO should be similar to a CFO where it's direct to the CEO, right? That I think is the most effective, right? To have the CEO's ear, a CISO is usually most effective in that position. But I think there's just levels of, let's make sure what we're calling a CISO is like clearly defined and understood.
Excellent.
Because sometimes it is a risk officer, sometimes it is just a compliance officer in different ways, and businesses need to understand that CISO isn't a catch-all, right?
Yep.
There's differences.
It all depends on culture and so forth, but yes, we all need to work better together. So I thank all of you as panelists for being here. Thank you in the audience for sitting through, and hopefully we've made some impact. So thank you very much.